Hi, we are going to continue on this model element, parent-child relationships. This session is Relationships 201. We're going to focus on trauma, stress, and resiliency. Earlier, we talked about the scientific foundation for the mechanisms involved in the relationships, specifically the parent-child relationship. In this section, we will look through the lens of the child's environment, of the relationships as it relates to some of the most vulnerable families, and the impact and the importance of supporting child development within the context of trauma and stress. We will focus on the following learning objectives. We will consider research and understand the effect of stress and trauma on early development. We will identify 3 types of stress as identified by the Centers for Disease Control, the ACE study. You will be able to analyze the necessary characteristics of relationships that have the potential to mitigate the effects of toxic stress in the child's life and promote learning and healthy development. You will also be able to identify the 5 foundational elements of resilience. Everybody knows who Fred Rogers is. All learning comes to us through relationships, which means something to us personally. Relationships are linked to cognitive development and learning. Parents and caregivers play a significant role in the development of higher order functions. Young children's relationships with their primary caregivers have a major impact on their cognitive, linguistic, emotional, social, and moral development. These relationships are the most growth promoting when they are warm, nurturing, individualized, and responsive. Now, I want you to stop and reflect upon these questions. What do you know about this world? What do you specifically know about this world? How did you learn what you know about the world? Even a book is a relationship between us and the author. We exchange ideas in a variety of ways. Relationships really matter. A key finding is that young children experience their world as an environment of relationships, and these relationships affect virtually all aspects of their development. Healthy relationships set the foundation for all aspects of development, including social emotional development, and as we discussed, learning or cognitive development. Loving relationships set the example to teach children about forming relationships and friendships, communicating emotions, and dealing with challenges. They teach children about empathy, compassion, and a sense of right or wrong. If a child is surrounded by healthy, functional relationships, he is free to invest his developmental energy into learning and making his own healthy adjustments to the world. Now, if a child is surrounded by dysfunctional relationships, this puts the child into survival mode. And in this mode, a child may become hypervigilant and must spend all that energy that should go into development into managing stress. We're going to look at gene environment impact. Brain development is largely based upon our unique DNA and genetic blueprint. However, the brain adapts to the environment that we are born into. The environment and the early experiences both have the last say on how the brain ultimately develops, which is epigenetics. Epigenetics is the field of study that looks at changes caused by the environmental influences that modify gene expression. Epigenetic changes are long-term, and these changes may be passed down to children and grandchildren. Both positive and negative experiences can affect whether or not a gene in a child's DNA is activated or deactivated. Examples are mental health, psychiatric disorders, but also in cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity, alcoholism, and cancer. Now we're going to look at research, and we're going to look at toxic stress in the brain. This comes from a study from the developing child from Harvard University. Brain research over the last 20 years has yielded lots of information, but there is a science policy gap. We know more about what children need, but we have yet adjusted our bureaucracies to reflect what we know about these children. Researchers have gathered much data on brain development. They have produced papers for us to interpret the data so that we can understand it. The gap that is in progress now is applying this in your work with children and families every day. This on the screen is the website that has the working papers in which the papers can be found. There are 12 as of today, and you can search under the research library and filter for working papers in toxic stress. These working papers have taken the scientific information discovered about the brain and translated into the knowledge we have. The science of toxic stress. The science of toxic stress relates to the buildup of hormones as a result of repeated stress, causing levels of toxicity, which inevitably affects the way the body works, potentially resulting in many physical illnesses later in life. Ultimately, what this research tells us time and time again is that the child may not consciously remember everything negative that happens to them, but their body does remember. Now, this study, the ACEs study, is from the Center of Disease Control. It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences. The CDC Kaiser Permanent Adverse Child Experiences, or the ACE study, is one of the largest investigations of childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges that later in life, health and well-being. The initial phase of the ACE study was conducted from 1995 to 1997, with more than 17,000 participants who had a standardized physical examination. No further participants will be enrolled, but we are tracking the medical status of the baseline participants, and this study continues. Each study participant completed a confidential survey that contained questions about childhood maltreatment and family dysfunction, as well as items detailing their current health status and behaviors. This information was combined with the results of their physical examination to form that baseline data for the study. The young brain is especially vulnerable to stress. When prolonged stress occurs during infancy and childhood, the stress hormone cortisol is released throughout the young brain and the body. The stress hormones compromise the normal brain development and immature immune and nervous system. The study defined 3 types of stress that we will discuss in great detail. We found that research on the biology of stress helps explain some of the underlying causal mechanisms for differences in learning, in behavior, and in physical and mental health. All right, what are the ACEs? The Adverse Childhood Experience, or ACE, is the term used to describe all types of abuse, neglect, and other potentially traumatic experiences that occur to people under the age of 18. Growing up experiencing any of the following conditions listed on the screen in the household prior to 18 years of age. Let's now look at the list. It includes recurrent physical abuse, recurrent emotional abuse, contact sexual abuse, a substance abuser in the household, an incarcerated household member or a family member in jail, a family member who is chronically depressed, mentally ill, institutionalized, or suicidal, a mother that is treated violently, one or no parents, physical neglect, and emotional neglect. Now, findings from that ACE study. The early childhood adversity can influence a range of negative lifelong outcomes, which include injury, mental health, maternal health, which could be an unintended pregnancy or complications, or even fetal health, death. Infectious diseases, chronic disease, such as cancer or diabetes, risky behaviors, such as drug and alcohol abuse, or maybe even unsafe sex, or opportunities. The impact of the ACEs is exponential. If a child has 6 ACEs, it's way more powerful than 3. It weighs even more than the number would suggest. For example, if you have had a childhood experience from one of the categories, not the incident, but one category, your odds of developing depression is 50 times more likely than someone with no ACE. If you have had a childhood experiences from 5 or more categories, not 5 incidences, but 5 categories, you are nearly 400 times more likely to develop depression than someone with no ACE. The same results are true for cancer, high blood pressure, stroke, diabetes, weight gain, exhaustion, reduced growth hormone level, compromised immune function, and bone loss. within the 17,000 middle class, ethnically diverse American adults tested, it was found that the compulsive use of nicotine, alcohol, and injected street drugs increased proportionally with the level of adverse life experiences reported during childhood. So as the number of ACEs increases, so does the risk for negative health outcomes. I want you to reflect. Think about a child that you are concerned about. Can you identify the type of stress that the child may be experiencing in his or her environment? Now, let's look at the impact of stress and trauma on the developing brain. We are going to look at these two brains, and we're going to compare these brain scans. On the left side is a typically developing brain, and on the right is a scan of a brain of a child with exposure to trauma. With the stress, the body reacts by releasing stress hormones such as cortisol. It prepares the body for fight or flight by activating or shutting down certain things for the sake of perceived survival. Toxic stress results in consistently high levels of stress, fight or flight, hormones in the system that can damage the developing brain architecture and create a short fuse for the body's stress response system, leading to lifelong problems in learning and behavior, physical and mental health. The results in changing brain connections in a way that interferes with the ability to focus and retain information and manage strong feelings. You can clearly see the difference in both of the scans. Now, stress and our reaction to it can be thought of as an existing along a continuum. The differences between the stress reactions is how well one can bounce back, which is, as we have mentioned, very much dependent upon the relationships and the support a child has to help him cope and make stress tolerable instead of toxic. We're now going to look at the different types of stress. There are 3 types. The first one that we're going to focus on is positive stress. Positive stress is moderate, short-lived stress responses, such as brief increases in the heart rate or mild changes in the stress hormone levels. It can include the challenges of meeting new people, dealing with frustration, maybe getting an immunization or a shot, or just adult limit setting. It's an important and necessary aspect of healthy development that occurs in the context of stable and supportive relationships. The second type of stress is tolerable stress. Stress responses that could disrupt the brain architecture, but are buffered by the supportive relationships that facilitate adaptive coping. It includes death or a serious illness of a loved one, maybe a frightening injury, a parent divorce, a natural disaster, terrorism, or homelessness. It generally occurs within a time-limited period, which gives the brain an opportunity to recover from potentially damaging effects. The last type of stress is toxic stress. This is strong, prolonged activation of the body's stress management systems in the absence of that buffering protection of the adult support that is needed. It includes extreme poverty, physical or emotional abuse, chronic neglect, severe mental depression, substance abuse, or family violence. Toxic stress disrupts brain architecture and leads to the stress management system that respond in a relatively lower thresholds, thereby increasing the risk of stress-related physical and mental illness. Now, with those three types of stress, let's take time to reflect. Where have you observed toxic stress? Think about that. Have you observed toxic stress in your life? In a child's life? Or in a family's life? There is good news. A loving relationship with a primary caregiver neutralizes the effect of toxic stress. Measurable biochemical changes in children when they can count on loving support from the adults in their environment. Hashtag One Caring Adult is a movement that has grown out of the ACEs study after filmmakers James Redford created movies on the topic of toxic stress. Paper Tigers is about teens who have had toxic stress, are suffering the impact of the ACEs. The film Resilience, the science of stress and biology of hope, about the positive impact of having one caring adult in the child's life. The relationships provide personalized responsiveness, scaffolding, and that protection that can buffer children from the developmental disruption. They also build key capacities, such as the ability to plan, to monitor, and regulate behavior that enable children to respond adaptively to adversity and to thrive. The combination of supportive relationships, adaptive skill building, and positive experiences is the foundation of resilience. Again, hashtag One Caring Adult. The single most common factor for children to develop resilience is at least one stable, committed relationship with a supportive caregiver, parent, or another adult. Now let's look at the brain plasticity and as it decreases over time. Fortunately, this brain plasticity, or the ability to rewire connection, is the greatest in childhood, and it gives us an opportunity for neutralizing the effects of toxic stress. Now, this ability goes down significantly as we grow older, and it takes much more effort. Learning a new language is an example. Our brains are much more open to learning a new language in the first years of life than we are in our 30s, 40s, and 50s. So they have that ability early on in childhood and have the greatest opportunity for neutralizing that toxic stress. Where does this resilience come from? Are some children just born that way, or is it something that they learn? Are there things that we can do to help children become more resilient? This is what we know. Temperament plays a part. Children are not born resilient. Some are born with a high threshold for tolerating distress. They are easy to comfort and more likely to be resilient. Some are born very sensitive to any stimulation. They're easily overwhelmed. Temperament appears to be determined by the combination of the genetics and the environment of the womb. Distressed mothers with poor prenatal care will more likely have children with difficult to soothe temperament types. This is important, especially as we visit families. Attuned caregiving. No matter the child's temperament, the capacity to deal with the stressors is shaped by the caregiver. Calm, experienced caregiver can help a difficult to soothe child quiet down and feel safe. In this time, this will influence the child's ability to respond to stress in a positive way. Conversely, an anxious, inexperienced, and isolated caregiver, even with an easy to soothe child, could ultimately shape this child to be less capable of dealing with distress. The goodness of fit between the caregiver and the infant plays an important role in developing resilience. Healthy attachment. Children with poor bonding with the primary caregiver or attachment problems will be less resilient. Related to this important role, the connection to other people plays in the capacity to survive traumatic stress. Attachment is key. Having that strong attachment with the primary caregivers plays an important role. Opportunities for practice. Must build our stress response systems through practice. Young children are continually exposed to new developmental challenges in motor, emotional, social, and cognitive areas. This gradual gaining of new skills give a child experience with facing a challenge, developing mastery, and experiencing success. Hope is the foundation for resilience. Resilience cannot exist without hope. It is the capacity to be hopeful that carries us through challenges, disappointments, loss, and traumatic stress. The child who is capable of thinking that things will be better, that bad feelings in the situation he now faces will improve. He will be more resilient. Children's cognitive abilities also affect their ability to be resilient. The child who learns quickly and can learn from a few experiences will have an easier time drawing upon his own experience and his capacity to imagine a future that is happier and safer. The child's ability to feel special. This belief comes from a significant adult in the child's life, whether it's a parent, a grandparent, a teacher. reassuring him that he is unique, he is important, and he is special. A child's sense of his own unique role in the world will help him to sustain during chronic traumatic events. Strong cognitive abilities and a sense of feeling special. Someone is crazy about them. Strengthening family protective factors. The Center for the Study of Social Policies Strengthening Families framework provides us with the protective factors to promote in families to support well-being. These protective factors can buffer children against a cumulative impact of adverse childhood experiences. All of these factors have been shown to mitigate or eliminate risk and enhance the well-being of children and families. This links directly to the roles of the family support worker or home visitor and the programs that support the families. Programs support protective factors, things via the trustworthy system of support and the trustworthy system of relationships. So for programs or home visitors, it is important to support parental knowledge of the parent-child rearing and development, its physical, social, emotional, and temperament through the Baby Talk curriculum, through the Baby Talk critical concepts, and through the effective strategies, such as tell me about your baby, supporting parental mastery, meaning making, and narrating the behavior. Also, provide social and community connections. This is building relationships through visits, through group encounters, and through those interactions. Support parental resilience, helping parents reflect on their parenting, reflecting upon their relationships with their children, and facilitating the parent-child interactions, which is coming alongside families. Providing resources for families, lending an ear to the parent to support them emotionally, and in turn, this helps them understand their child's development and supports the child in this area, which is the systems building and the collaborations that we do with our families. How might we build our own knowledge and skills as a professional? For some of you, understanding trauma and working to help families find their resilience may feel very comfortable. But for others, it may feel a bit overwhelming. So how might we build our knowledge and our skills? The Baby Talk curriculum. There is a section for professional reflection called Trauma Informed, where we can learn about some of the common types of traumas encountered by families we work with. Here you can see it listed out. Also think about the professional development opportunities that you may have the opportunity to do to help you build those knowledge and skills. Take advantage of those personal development opportunities. Also think about the reflective practice. Reflect upon what went well, what worked, what could I have done differently? How can I support that family? Also think about reflective supervision. Reflective supervision is key. Reflecting upon what is happening with your families and how you can support them. Now, we are going to take a look at current terminology. Trauma-informed It used to be child trauma informed, which is an understanding of trauma and the awareness of the impact it can have across settings, across the services you provide, and across the population that you see. Now, trauma sensitive goes deeper than trauma informed. Trauma informed is like our curriculum. Trauma sensitive is the culture where everyone feels safe. It's creating a programmatic culture that makes families feel safe, they feel welcomed, and they feel supported. We're using language that is compassionate and respectful to those families. The next term is healing-centered. Healing-centered approach is to address trauma. It requires a different question that moves beyond what happened to you, moving it to what's right with you, and the views those exposed to trauma as agents in the creation of their own well-being rather than victims of traumatic events. Healing-centered is the approach or how we go forward with our families. What is right with you? Let's take a look at the healing-centered engagement. The healing-centered engagement, the way the work is going now, it uses culture as a way to ground people in a solid sense of meaning, self-perception, and purpose. Every family has a culture, and every person who experiences trauma does not do so solo or in a vacuum, but with the cultural factors and the relationships at play. Asset-driven. Instead of focusing on the deficits, let's focus on what's going well for you instead of what happened to you. The FRA, or the Family Resource Assessment, used in strength-based way and planning visits based on strengths and goal making. Now, focusing on the strengths and the resilience they have shown and building upon those. Looking at the resources they have assessed, that they have the skills attained, it parallels to going where families are, coming alongside those families, and working in collaboration with those families. Supports provide their own healing. So those supports providers with their own healing. Healing is a process that we all need. Again, this may be new to many of you. Building healing-centered engagement. What we say matters. Compassionate communication. We recognize and set aside judgments, biases, and demands in the moment. We build genuine curiosity of the person's feelings and dreams. Eliminating the qualifier in front of the word child and family. Families are not broken and not in need of fixing. Many of those qualifiers are fluid, homeless, low income, ELL. They can only label or stereotype a child or a family. If you wouldn't add that word in the front of a child's name, then don't use it. Consider families under-resourced through no fault of their own, but from the community system that is not available to them for many reasons. Look at the person first language. Instead of saying a depressed person, you would say a person with depression. Instead of saying at-risk kids, low-income families, you would say kids with risk factors. Now, thank you very much for joining, and we thank you. You now will complete a self-study on the Relationships 201. Thank you.